So good afternoon. You're all very welcome to our Sustainable Enterprise webinar series. My name is Kathleen O'Regan and I'm a Senior Executive in the Sustainability Solutions Department of Enterprise Ireland. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and we will share slides and the recording afterwards, and the recording will also be available to watch back on the Enterprise Ireland website. We're delighted to be able to host this webinar, Sustainability Trends for Business, in collaboration with Forfis Mazars. And I am joined today by my colleague Ankush Shirsat, who's here in the background helping out, and by Johnny Meehan and Liam McKenna of Forfis Mazars, who will share their insights on sustainability trends for business. So we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions, just pop them into the Q&A and we hope to be able to answer them at the end. So I think it's fair to say we are living in a changing world, and we are seeing unprecedented amounts of wildfires, droughts and flooding. And every scientific report is showing us that we're breaking records in the wrong direction. Last year was the warmest year on record. The average temperature increase was greater than 1.5 degrees. Europe is the fastest warming continent. And with increasing customer and stakeholder expectations and with changing geopolitical and the policy landscape, it has never been more important for companies to evaluate and analyse their competitiveness. And this includes placing a strategic focus on climate action and sustainability. So Enterprise Ireland is committed to working with our client companies as they navigate this journey to a low carbon sustainable future. And as outlined in our new strategy, our primary objectives is to accelerate sustainable Irish business. Our vision is to grow the sustainable impact, resilience and reputation of our client base. And key targets under our recently published sustainability plan include a 35% reduction in emissions for Enterprise Ireland supported client companies, and also for 80% of our supported companies to have a sustainability plan in place and to measure the scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2029. So this year's webinar series will focus on several aspects of sustainability, including green public procurement, ESG policies, sustainability regulations, and sustainability reporting. So I'd now like to introduce both Johnny and Liam. So Johnny Meehan is Head of Sustainability Consulting at Forfis Mazars in Ireland and advises clients across all sectors on sustainability, including strategy, risk, competitiveness, regulatory compliance, procurement and supply chain management. He has 20 years of international experience as a leader for sustainability. Liam McKenna joined Forfis Mazars' Global Sustainability Leadership Team in 2019 and is the lead partner of CSRD projects for organisations across a range of sectors. Liam provides assurance services over carbon reporting and supports organisations in calculating their carbon emissions. And Liam has over 25 years experience developing and leading strategies from change management, large technology and process projects to staff and organisation design, and more recently, sustainability reporting. So I'll hand over to Johnny and to Liam, and we'll take Q&A at the end. So look, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, just a quality check there, Kathleen. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, it's all good, Johnny.
Super stuff. Okay, so hello and welcome. Thank you very much for the introduction, Kathleen, and the team at Enterprise Ireland. So myself and Liam are going to co-deliver this very short presentation to talk about what we're hearing and seeing in the sustainability landscape, and with a particular focus on trends, looking at this year where so much is happening so quickly, and especially looking out to 2030, so over the next 5 years. So you've had an introduction about the two of us. Unless there's something else you'd like to say, Liam, in addition to your introduction?
No, not at all.
Grand, okay, and the same with myself. The one thing I would say is, I suppose, is a gateway into sustainability. Everybody tuning in here today, either you're a seasoned practitioner or you've gotten to know sustainability through the compliance or regulatory landscape. For myself, my entry was through strategy and supply chain management, and it's interesting how so much focus is on those areas at the moment. Now, the simple enough structure we have for you today is it's going to get 5 areas, we are going to go through a broad sweep, I would say, of global themes. So looking at a kind of a high global level, the international perspective, and then looking at the European angle, and then coming down further into the Irish context. And we're going to be introducing this term called the sustainability fundamentals. Similar enough to where you talk about the fundamentals in a market around supply and demand, for example, as distinct from speculation, for example, on, say, commodities. And we're going to use this funnel, in a sense, to start broad and to narrow in, which is why we've identified two focus areas really to focus on, because I believe that they may be of most interest to you. The first area is really around what's been happening lately, say in Q1 of this year and the last quarter of last year. It's about the regulatory landscape, particularly in the EU, and the changes that have taken place with regard to compliance, especially use of this term, the Omnibus. Then we'll be talking about a pivot in how there's a push-pull dynamic here between compliance and competitiveness, because there are risks and there are also opportunities under the EU Green Deal. The second area of focus we're going to look at is around competitiveness. So we're going to be talking about things like risk and resilience, but also value creation. We're going to be having a business conversation as distinct from, say, a sustainability conversation. And then we've got room at the end. Hopefully we'll get your questions in and we'll be able to answer them. So they say at the start of a presentation, you should create a sense of urgency. And given the topics that we're talking about today, we don't have to fake this urgency, it's real. Last week, of course, was interesting in that we had Earth Day, and there was a good story in the BBC website that I was reading about a picture that was taken by astronauts 50 odd years ago. The date was December 17, 1972, and it was taken by the astronauts on the Apollo 17 mission. So they had been far enough away from Earth to capture the whole Earth in a picture. And it was humans taking this picture. And what they used, of course, being 1972, it was an analog shutterbox camera. Now, what's interesting is that they take so many pictures, but they decided to try and take another picture 50 years exactly to the time, the date, and so on, so that the Earth would be in a northern hemisphere in a winter cycle. It would be approximately in its orbit around the sun in the same position. And so they're trying to equalize factors such as season and the tilt of the Earth and how the sun shines on the Earth. And what was interesting was that there was a notable degree of difference in luminosity. Now, this is just in 50 years. So I don't know if you can tell which is the older picture and which is the more recent picture.
Yeah. And Johnny, well, I think the one on the left looks brighter. It looks a little bit like a hazy day if you're looking out over a city on the right. But that isn't because of the camera, is it?
Well, you know, when I was reading the article myself, I was thinking, what has changed in 50 years? Of course, you've got a human taking this on the left. You've got a machine from a satellite taking this on the right. You've got a different camera, so an analog one on the left and a digital one on the right. And NASA tried to, I suppose, correct some of these, you might say, differences, adjust for them. But because they were able to zoom in at a micro level, we're only seeing the big picture here. What they were doing was explaining what has really happened to the Earth. Remember, this is only in 50 years. And the differences are, with regard to luminosity, is that given the differences in the cloud cover, the ice cover, so the cryosphere, which would include the glacial caps, mountains. Remember, it's winter time in the northern hemisphere as well. And we have the Arctic and Antarctic ice cover. There's a profound difference in the whiteness of the Earth, so that the reflectivity of the sun's rays back into space, it has dimmed. The other thing, of course, is that the composition of the oceans and of the atmosphere has changed in those 50 years. If you think about 50 years ago, well, I say 50 years, 1972, just a few weeks after I was born, which is why I'm probably a little bit sentimental about this. But at the time, of course, the parts per million in the atmosphere of carbon concentration was around 325 parts per million, whereas in only 50 years, it's now, the picture was taken in December 22, it was at 420 parts per million. Now that's a profound difference given the fact it's only 50 years. And before that, if you took 1972 as a baseline, it had been fairly stable for hundreds of thousands of years. So this is shot up. And because of this, these different composition of the atmosphere and also in waters as well, where you have coral bleaching, you have increased acidity, you have more pollution, that light travels differently now through the atmosphere and through oceans, which also accounts for it. But the biggest things, of course, was the scarring on the earth, in that there's been more brown and less green. So we're seeing that within the seas, there's less phytoplankton and other, you would say, plant life. And then on the land, you would see that the Sahara and the sub-Sahara in the Sahel has expanded, whereas the rainforests in Western Africa, and particularly in South America, have retreated. In fact, in the Amazon's case, it has gone from being a carbon sink to becoming a net carbon emitter. So all of this has happened in 50 years, changing the very look of our planet. So the message here is that we have done this. And I think it's a good place to start, just for the simple fact that how many conversations have each of us been in talking about sustainability? And it feels as if it's so technical now, and there are so many, there's so much terminology or language to learn, that the big picture about why we're doing all of this is lost. This is the reason why we are embarking on transforming our economy and society. Now, the fundamentals of sustainability is a term I'd like you to become familiar with. And I'd like you to think about the longer term. Let's say shorter term is the next 5 years, and the longer term is out to 2040 or 2050, when many countries and companies have set their net zero commitments. So there's a lot of noise, I think we can agree on at the moment, to distract us. And what we have seen is that over the last 10 years since the Paris Agreement, and 2025 is the 10-year anniversary, we've been building up bit by bit every year to this moment. And only in the last month or two, for the reasons where I think we're all familiar, there's been a lot of noise. It feels as if, given the amount of noise, that the fundamentals have changed, when they haven't. Because even if you were to do your own research, and there are many outlook reports out there, from the World Economic Forum report at Davos at the end of January and going into February, that there's a fairly consistent outlook on what's important in the short term and what's more important further out than 2030. And we've identified 10 things for you to be aware of. Now, this is in a broad international sweep before we start funneling down into Europe and Irish level. So what I would say is, and which is why I've highlighted it in blue, is that the next 5 years are critical. We can turn things around, and we have all of the technologies and the solutions within right now, I think 90% of them, and funding to draw down to complete to 100%, to transform our economy and society. So the fundamentals are sound, and we know from what Kathleen said at the introduction that it's becoming a very volatile, even more uncertain and unpredictable, complex and ambiguous world out there. So we've identified 10 things. There's 5 on this slide. I'm going to start off with 1 before I hand it over to Liam to talk about his areas. And the one that I will lead off with is about policy, because it is a part of, I think, why you're here, part of Kathleen's introduction as well, in that we do have a policy landscape of which you should be aware. And I've mentioned the Paris Agreement going back to 2015, which is an international treaty with 196 signatures. A few have withdrawn. And that sets the tone for what we all need to do. And the objective was to achieve a transformation in that we adhere to a planetary boundary on global climate heating to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And another scenario to stay well below 2 degrees. So this was the Paris Agreement, and from that we had the EU that adopted, member states signed up to the Paris Agreement, And then we have this kind of transposition into EU law. In that, there is the creation of a whole structure with the EU net zero plan to stay below 2 degrees or as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. We had lots of guiding policies for the strategy. And then we had a series of different policy areas with regulations and directives. And then, because it's EU law, there's a transposition process into Irish law, which is why in Ireland we have the Climate Action Plan, which is backed into law by the Low Carbon Act. And then we have a whole suite of policies around that. We have government departments that are given mandates down from government to state agencies to have their own strategies. And it's interesting how, for example, in IDA's case and Enterprise Ireland's case, they have recently published their own 5-year strategy looking out to the next 2029, 2030. And even the Government of Ireland, under the new programme for government, is at the midway point of the Climate Action Plan, which ran from the start of this decade out to 2030. We're at the midway point, which means that the carbon budgets that were set in the first half are coming to an end this year. And then we're starting with new carbon budgets to cover us for the next 5 years. Now, those budgets will be aligned with what's called national determined contributions of what Ireland, what our carbon inventory is, and then the plans around that of how we're going to stay aligned with the Paris Treaty. So that's the policy landscape. And we're going to go into it in greater detail.
Yeah, if I jump in maybe on the energy, and I think we won't cover all 10 items. I'm just going to pick off 2 on this slide, and then we'll pick off another couple on the next slide. But maybe to just jump into energy, like when you look in Ireland and you look at the different components of our emissions, you know, agriculture, transport, built environment, energy is probably the shining light to date. When you look at EirGrid, it has a very transparent plan and to get to 2030 and to deliver on the net zero strategy of the country. The National Development Plan has a lot of money in the plan to shift the energy grid so that at the moment it's really assuming generation on the East Coast and transfer of energy towards the West Coast. So it's kind of thicker on one side and getting narrower. And we need to flip that because you know, our plan is really based on offshore wind energy, which is going to be on the Atlantic coast and then be transferred across the country. And equally, now we have a new interconnector with France, which means we could be exporting, obviously, to the UK or to France now, and also we could be importing from either of those countries. And potentially, you know, we're going to be importing nuclear energy from France, which would be contentious, but certainly from a carbon perspective is a big reduction in carbon from gas. Unfortunately, I suppose we are very dependent, despite what the government is doing, we're also very dependent upon capital from private industry to build these wind farms. There's 6 wind farms that are really large, which were planned for Ireland over the coming years and licensed. And unfortunately, one of those last week was announced that it wasn't going to go ahead. The reason given was the shelf under Galway Bay, kind of Connemara area, wasn't capable of withstanding the forces that the wind turbines would have. Whether or not that's the case or it's related to finance or something else, we don't know. But I think that's energy is probably an area where Ireland would be somewhat hopeful. And then on the finance side, Johnny mentioned about 90% of the technologies being available to achieve the transition that we need to achieve. Unfortunately, only about 45% of the finance is in place. And so, you know, we often talk about sustainability and we're a little bit overwhelmed by it. And people think it's just, we cannot overcome this challenge. The reality is that World War II cost the Allies 50% of their GDP, and it cost the Axis 100% of theirs. COVID cost about 15% of GDP to deal with. Climate change would cost about 3 to 5% of GDP, based on various different surveys and numbers and economists to actually to fix. So this is a political problem. This is not a problem that cannot be overcome. And finance is a really big barrier to it, and obviously prioritization and immediacy. So Ireland actually has achieved a big objective recently where the UN Development Programme identified or is now establishing its Global Project Office for Sustainable Finance in Dublin. And there was an announcement last week the World Bank and the UN had a forum in New York, and the ministers announced that this office was being set up in Dublin. So that's really positive. But as I say, from a finance perspective, we need to get more finance flowing. And it is really just a finance problem that we have here. Maybe we jump across then, Johnny, onto the next slide.
Yeah, I can jump into supply chains now. I suppose I've already mentioned it's my 20 years of experience working in them. It's amazing how they come back into vogue now, and driven by things like, global trade, tariffs. We had the COVID emergency, which Liam mentioned, and we know how supply chain workers became frontline workers. So we're going to have a mix of reshoring and movement of manufacturing around the world. And we don't know where that's going to go, so there's great uncertainty. But one thing is for sure, that there will be impacts where whatever happens, whether it's factories being rooted up and moved out or moved into other areas. And also, when you think about supply chains, you think about the inputs that are used in supply chains. So you've got energy going in to make products. You've got people. So you've got these potential risks around how people are treated and forced labor. And this again is about regulations coming in around due diligence. It's very important to conduct some form of supply chain due diligence. And as Liam mentioned, around having all of the technologies, we also have lots of the guidelines already in place. There's nothing holding anyone back here from doing their own supply chain due diligence exercise. And we have produced the UN guiding principles, which are explicitly recommended under the CSDDD, the Due Diligence Directive. And we produce them in a partnership with the Shift, and we do run training on that, which we would also recommend. So supply chain is going to be a massive area, particularly the impact on COGS and risks.
Yeah, and I suppose just for me to pick out one there, which you probably know a bit more about, is the AI one. Like AI is there's a pro and a con here, in the sense that we're going to be able to do much better prediction models, anticipate what's going to happen, I suppose plan better for climate adaptation, because obviously now we're not going to avoid necessarily the impact of climate change, but we need to be able to plan for it as well. And AI can help with areas such as the grid, and the fact that it's very hard for us to store energy at the moment. We're trying to generate the energy and use it immediately, and AI can help a lot in predicting that requirement and maybe maximizing the value we get from the resources we put into the grid, into creating that energy. Now, obviously, the flip side of that is we're all very conscious of the use of AI using more energy. There's a lot of money going into data centers, which are purely AI data centers. Microsoft actually has a deal now with 3 Mile Island in New York, that nuclear energy facility, which had a meltdown, didn't have a meltdown. It had an incident way back in the 70s. But Microsoft is now going to buy nuclear energy from 3 Mile Island in order to power its AI AI systems. So there's two different sides to this. Certainly, AI should be able to help us come up with better understanding of what's going to happen, maybe invoke a greater sense of urgency, show what the models will say. It may also be able to use energy more efficiently, or there might be other uses that we haven't thought of yet, which are going to help us become more sustainable. The flip side of that is it uses a lot of energy, and how are we going to generate that energy? Because ultimately that's a challenge for us.
Okay, so I mentioned at the start, we're going to start out broad and then move our way in through the funnel. So we need to talk about the European context here. So we have the European Green Deal. And we also have the net zero side of things, which is, you could view one really related to funding for the transition, the Green Deal, because nothing will happen unless capital moves from the old brown economy into the green ecological economy. So there's a series of supports around here. So the European Commission and the European institutions, and particularly the European Central Bank, the European Investment Bank, and a lot of funds that were set up, the ELENA Fund, and then also the Innovation Fund on the Horizon Europe, of which Enterprise Ireland is the gatekeeper. They're looking to move all of this finance now down into the real economy. So they're looking for a transformation within companies, established companies, diversification of portfolios into other things to create insets inside companies, rather than having to, to buy offsets from elsewhere and transfer payments. And so this is a whole model that will change the entire context around which your business will operate. This is one of the sustainability fundamentals in Europe in particular. And if you also think about who's in lockstep with us, it's China. So the US is very much kind of outside of this at the moment, but they also had up until recently their own Green Deal. And the economy is moving in the direction anyway around renewables. So a couple of things just to highlight here. The idea of high stakes risks, that's what sustainability is. So you need a mitigation plan for this. The idea of competitive sustainability, because you should be seeing it now rather than as a cost center, as a profit center. And there are opportunities here and there's funding available. So we have what's called Fit for 55. So it's about getting your business model, getting your entire capability, leveraging that to be fit enough to compete in the new European economy. And the 2030 deadline is there because it's also about being just over halfway to net zero by that date. So I will move on from Europe.
Yeah, into CSRD, which I suppose like ultimately the Paris Agreement led through the EU net zero into European Green Deal, which Johnny just covered. And then it came, well, what do we start to do then at a technical level to make all this real? And so the ESRS were defined and the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive requirements were defined. Now, if you look on the right-hand side there, you'll see CSDDD, which is the Due Diligence Directive. The SFDR is about financial assets and classifying them under green or not green. And then the EU taxonomy really is it's a foundational element in the sense that it defines whether something is green or not green. And it goes into a lot of detail about it, and it really informs CSRD, CSDDD, SFDR. It's kind of used across all of those. And when organizations and banks need to classify their assets, they use the EU taxonomy. But ultimately, this is quite a complex slide. And what it's resulted in is probably that point down in the IBM point down the bottom right-hand corner is that according to IBM, research spending on sustainability reporting exceeded spending on sustainability innovation by 43%. And that was in February 2024. Now, last year was a very big year for CSRD and reporting, and both for Wave 1 and Wave 2 companies. So the likelihood is that in February 2025, over the last year, that figure, more than 50% is being spent on reporting. So we have this challenge where, to some extent, reporting we were hoping it was going to drive change, in that once it became apparent where organizations were with regard to their sustainability journey, more pressure would be applied upon them to move faster. The flip side of that is organizations were so exhausted meeting the CSRD obligations and spent so much of their budgets on it that it was going to slow down real change as well. So, what we're seeing now, or what we've seen, is the Omnibus, as Johnny has said, and maybe if we just move on to the next slide and we can touch on the Omnibus and what it means. So we started to hear about this like mid to late last year. It's part of a EU competitiveness drive, which Mario Draghi has championed, and he really led the Omnibus definition. And there's been a couple of impacts on it. But the first impact is that there were Wave 1 companies, actually, which aren't impacted. There were Wave 2 companies, and these were companies with more than 250 staff, and a couple of financial requirements around 25 million and 50 million of revenue and assets. And so those Wave 2 companies with over 250 staff, there was a stop the clock put in immediately for them, the stop the clock directive, which means organizations, there's a postponement of reporting for those waves, Wave 2 and ultimately Wave 3, for a couple of years. So where they would have had to report on the 25 year end in 2026, so we had anticipated that this time next year, we'd be seeing CSRD reports from organizations of more than 250 staff being published on their financial year 2025. That's now been pushed out to 2028. And equally, all the other deadlines have been equally pushed out 2 years. That's just the stop the clock directive. There is a second directive, which is the content directive, which is about simplicity and removing organizations from the scope of CSRD altogether. So in effect, they stop the clock now and bought time. But the expectation is the content directive will also come through. And what that means is that it's only companies over 1,000 employees who are now going to be required to do CSRD reporting. And so that takes out any organization that had between 250 and 1,000 employees was previously really focused on CSRD, and they're now able to go, well, what's the right thing for us to do? Because we don't have to mandatorily report under CSRD. So that's really the main thing, that the content directive hasn't fully passed yet. The Stop the Clock has, but it's 99% expected that will happen later this year. Have I covered everything there, Johnny?
Yeah, you have. I mean, we could talk a little bit about maybe our own surprise at the omnibus itself. I think we expected it to be about simplicity rather than, say, the content directive, which was about almost rescoping.
Mm. Yeah, like, I don't know, I found personally, I had thought CSRD, like I think Kathleen said at the start, I got into sustainability really in 2019. And I was hoping to have an impact. And I thought CSRD myself would be a great opportunity to drive change. However, I did become a bit cynical last year when I saw organization of, maybe 20, 30, 40 million, small organizations, relatively small turnover, having to spend hundreds of thousands just on reporting. And you're going, if they could buy solar panels, if they could retrofit their buildings, if they could, put their fleet into electric, that would actually have an impact. What are we doing here? We're bringing them through an auditing experience and kind of what isn't really adding a huge amount of value. So I suppose the challenge is there is a message being sent to the market, which is let's downgrade sustainability. That's how it's being interpreted, right? That, yeah, it's not as important anymore. Coming back to your blue pearl in the sky, obviously it is. So, I think what we're now seeing is that some organizations are going, well, there's a lot more going on. And that's we're hoping to work with the organizations that are focused on actually changing. And we still need that, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. And also the fact that, unfortunately, the thing about the omnibus and there's a spillover effect somewhat, the message has got kind of lost in that there's no stop the clock on sustainability at all, because we have 5 years to make the transformation. And there's a significant cost for not making that change at a governmental level, and also the lost opportunities as well at a business level too. I mean, what I put down here is some of the insights I think we've gleaned from working with companies over the last couple of years. These are practical in the field insights from working with clients. We've got wave one. Of course, Liam mentioned that the evidence is coming out. One of the things that was unfortunate about the omnibus was that they didn't wait for the evidence to come out about how, in a sense, it had radically shaken up the gap that was seen at the start in 2020 when the Green Deal was announced, that there was such variation in reporting, such inconsistencies, entirely unreliable, and also only focused on the risks and opportunities, which has been a staple in the financial world for so long, and very little about impact. And for anybody who's working in sustainability, and if you remember the first slide here about planet Earth, it's all about impact. You have to have an understanding of your impact on the world, and going on to the supply chain point, you have to understanding of the scope of your operations directly and indirectly, how you impact the world. So the one thing I would say is I was a little bit skeptical, I have to say, of the CSRD and the work we were doing. But through the engagement, I think, for the clients who were asking questions, getting kind of mobilized, and CFOs in particular coming into the frame as leading the sustainability charge, I thought that was very positive. So what we see now, in a sense, is the back end of wave one clients who have the report, have gone through a very long methodology for, let's say a year. They come out at the end and they have lots of estimates and data gaps. What do they do? Maybe it is a feeling of a little bit underwhelmed that we've put all this effort in. What do we get at the end of it? Well, one of the opportunities now here is pivoting right back into where we were about the urgency of the crisis, getting into action. So we're talking about projects that make an impact, that produce the data, and you can collect those data from the real projects in the world, and then that becomes the basis of your report. For wave two companies, where they may have been midstream in work, where now the stop the clock is impacted or put a temporary break, allowing them time to figure out what it is they want to get out of this. That's one of the benefits of this, that there's more time. For anybody who's done a value chain assessment on this or stakeholder engagement, you're talking about 6 months of work doing that alone in workshops with leadership teams and operational teams, and sometimes around the world. Now for companies, particularly those who don't have much in the way of budget to spend on this, and Liam's mentioned that, we're talking about SMEs primarily, who grew into scope of CSRD by virtue of being a successful business and becoming large and falling into the criteria. Well, they're back now looking, what does this mean? What's the business oriented approach we need now so that it helps our strategy, it helps our value proposition, and it delivers savings on the bottom line as well by switching to lower cost inputs in the process. And as for way for kind of global entities that were further down the track anyway, well, they're looking now at interoperability. How does the CSRD interoperate, we can get that right, with other international frameworks such as the ISSB and GRI? So that's some of our kind of findings through casework over the last couple of years. Now, I said I'd get to Irish context, and now we're here, we're back home. There is a question I put at the top here. I might tee it up for you, Liam, if you want to say something about this. We're all required to deliver. We know that we have the Climate Action Plan. We know it's backed in law. We know there are mandates coming down from government to state agencies, and it's having a real impact on the overall economy. Why does so much need to be done in Ireland now in 2025 to catch up?
Hey, thanks for giving the heads up, Johnny.
Yeah, sorry about that.
What jumps to mind actually is I spoke to somebody in the risk function of a global insurance company, and they said they were German, and they said to me, it's very interesting. We did a European-wide survey, and we asked, should something be done about sustainability? And European-wide, everybody agreed yes, including in Ireland. And then they said, who should do something about that? And in Germany, most people said everybody is responsible. And in Ireland, the answer was the government. So I don't know. I think we don't maybe have the same perspective. It's unusual even when you look at that 26 billion, which is, you know, potentially at risk because we're going to have to buy offsets from Portugal and Spain, who are generating large amounts of solar energy. You know, we don't seem to recognize the urgency of this and what others have done, and maybe how far behind we are on the European perspective. I don't know. What do you think, Johnny?
Yeah, sorry for trying in there, but we had a good discussion about it. I just thought it was interesting to kind of ask the question. I think everybody should be asking the question. I think for myself, you know, when I considered it, it was almost looking at other countries. You do a comparative analysis. Like where I kind of live and have family in Sweden, they're so far ahead now in a sense that they're more than halfway to net zero. And as Liam mentioned there, we're only going to like having to pay make these transfer payments to countries that, you know, have it together, and they are actually implementing the plan. We're great in Ireland at doing the plan, but it just comes to implementation. So you could say at the start in 2020, 21, when we had the last version of the Climate Action Plan with that carbon budget, there wasn't a hell of a lot done before that, which meant we had a very steep hill to climb. And also, it's worth saying, for the last 5 years, we've fairly achievable targets. We also had the COVID kind of shutdown, which actually leveled out our impacts. And now for the 5 years ahead, we're going to have to double the performance in order to catch up. And there's no getting off the hook here. I've written down here 4 different things everybody on this call should be aware of. The fact that the Climate Action Plan is backed in the law, the fact that the fundamentals in Ireland are still strong. We have to hit this 51% reduction against a 2018 baseline by 2030. We have to produce our new NDCs that I mentioned earlier, aligned with the carbon budgets to honour our international commitments. And the minister came out and said, and it's true that there has been a shift in that we had a decent performance last year with a 6.8% reduction. Now, it's worth saying as well that not everybody is really, you know, charging ahead here. Some sectors are stuck and need help to get unstuck because they're very complex and hard to abate sectors. Other sectors that are charging ahead, let's say, for example, energy. We know there's lots of work to be done. Liam's already discussed it, but that's definitely delivering. And also when you think about competitiveness, huge opportunities for Ireland. Marie Donnelly, who's chair of the Climate Advisory Council, she came out strongly after the Fiscal Council identified the risk of 26 billion euro. That's a potential on cost or compliance cost, you might say, which would be a combination of different transfer payments we'd have to make, almost like an offsetting our way out of doing anything. And what would you do with 26 billion? So the joke going around, I suppose, was how many children's hospitals would that build? So that one's, I have no answer to that, but it's a significant amount of money that we could be doing other things with. And
I think three, Johnny, at least.
Sorry?
3 children's hospitals at least.
3 at least, yeah, that's
Yeah.
very, very good. Yeah, very good. And so we also have the National Development Plan. So like, we've so much to build, going back to Liam, kind of, putting the question back over to me. The advantage we have in Ireland is this. We have so much to build. We know all this. We have so much infrastructure to put in place. Therefore, it's going to be massive spending. The role of government is going to expand, and there are going to be huge opportunities. Of all the places in the world you want to be right now when it comes to positioning and sustainability, it's here, right in Ireland, because there's a very strong competitiveness case. And I put on the right there just a nod there to the strategies I mentioned. And if you're not doing a 5-year strategy for the next 5 years up to 2030, I would definitely have a look at that. Now, this is look like a circuit board. I'm putting it up there just to show you, almost like the complex slide Liam went through. We deliberately left it. Marketing would tell us simplify this, but this is how complex this area is when it comes to regulations. It's worth trying to take it in. On the left-hand side, we have regulations as they apply to financial institutions. On the right-hand side, we have those non-financial institutions. Let's say it's manufacturing and supply chain management for tangible products, the stuff we use in our everyday lives. That, because it extracts resources from the earth, has a material impact in a tangible way on the earth, which is why, if you look at that big yellow box I put around everything on the right, while we've been talking about the spine here down the middle, about the Green Deal and taxonomy and the two big directives we know of, on the right, I have seen very few compliance roadmaps looking out to 2030 that's even aware that so many regulations and directives are coming in with regard to prohibition of greenwashing when it comes to ESG ratings, which can misrepresent companies' true status, when it comes to circular economy, when it comes to eco-product labeling, when it comes to nature restoration. And nature restoration is a big deal because Minister Ryan last year, and Ireland in particular, helped get that over the line. It passed by one vote. I think the final vote was Austria, and that's coming in. And there'll be changes to the common agricultural policy you see at the bottom, and also a new energy and food security policy, because if you look at all of the sustainable development goals, something we haven't mentioned so far, all of them really hang around energy and food. You fix the food system and the energy system, and we're more than net zero. We're climate positive. So I did mention push and pull earlier on. This is a slide about it, really, just to show you that there is a different dynamic going on. On the top, which is why it's highlighted in green, there are market opportunities under the Green Deal. It's important to be aware of it and the funding you can draw down. And it's important to realize this is the new way business is going to be done. This is going to transform how you engage with customers, how you engage with your buyers, your suppliers, and investors, and how you obtain financing for growth. And that's what we're talking about now. We're not talking about degrowth. We're talking about sustainable growth in the new economy, because if you think about all the products that we use that we have to substitute for more sustainable options, even looking at your toothbrush in your daily routine, everything has to change. Therefore, we need lots of companies coming up with clever ideas. Innovation is going to be huge here, and that we're going to move the funding that's currently propping up. I think there's $3 trillion at the moment in subsidies going to fossil fuels globally, and they will have to switch across to renewable energy. And the thing will pay for itself, because if you think about the commodity inflation and all the changes we've had on the back of cost of living, well, if you consider that we had cheap, clean, affordable energy on our doorstep that we can export and add to our income receipts, Ireland would be in a lot better place right now, as would Europe. And then compliance, the bottom of the wheel. And you could use this wheel almost as part of your own strategy wheel to be aware, in a sense, on both aspects, push and pull. You have to be compliant, and the compliance landscape is going to change. We've already mentioned uncertainty around the Omnibus. We don't know what's going to come in in the content directive, but politics is a strange thing. We don't know where the tide's going to go out, where it's going to come back in, and when people will wake up and voting patterns will change. But one thing's for sure, given the recent voting through, there's a good centre block in Europe at the moment where defence, interestingly, is lining up a climate action. So I would recommend you check out how politics has shifted in Germany, for example.
Yeah. So where does that leave organizations now? So I think what we've seen is pillar 2 here, disclosures, has been very much the focus over the last 18 months, 2 years. So prior to that, we would have seen maybe a lot more of the strategic type work taking place. And what we're seeing now is that, again, as CSRD has gone from a very large number of organizations to about 10,000 organizations across Europe, which is still actually going to have a big impact from the perspective of these are the largest organizations that have the biggest impact, and there's 10,000 of them. There's a vast majority, 80% of organizations have been taken out of scope. And so their focus is less about CSRD now. And what we're seeing is it's about sustainability. And probably the organizations that I look at to see what would they actually want to do are the ones that started CSRD projects and subsequently found the Omnibus came in and they had a choice then. So, we had a number of clients who were in the middle of their CSRD project for wave 2, when the news came through that they weren't actually in scope for CSRD. But they had done their double materiality assessment and understood their value chain. And very much what we've seen in those organizations is they reached the point where stakeholders across the organization realized there was actually benefit and value in understanding how this changing world is going to impact on their business and understanding what the financial impact is and what they can do about it and how it's going to impact on their profits. And so we've seen those organizations actually go back into the strategy section and go, we've gotten some really interesting questions and we actually believe it's worthwhile answering those. So we're not going to necessarily go and do sustainability reporting next year because that's all about supporting external stakeholders in their demand for information. But we do recognize internally, having gone through the double materiality assessment, that we have some risks and issues and opportunities here, and we should definitely reflect these in our strategy, and it's going to derive some business value. And then what we're seeing is as they do those strategies, they get into impact projects and actually saying, okay, well, how do we become more resilient? And resilience actually has become one of the key things as we go to adaptation. So, we're not going to avoid all of the worst climate issues at this stage, but how are we going to adapt and how our business is going to be impacted and make sure their supply chains and their operations adapt from a risk perspective, but also then how can they reduce their costs, become more efficient, reduce their reliance on carbon-based fuels. So yeah, I would say over the last couple of years, we've seen it go from disclosures back to strategy and impact. The assurance piece is obviously a little bit different. Some organizations need that, others don't. And then sustainable finances, there's a whole difference. If you're in the financial services environment, there's a whole rake of extra stuff that the ECB are requiring of organizations.
Thanks, Liam, and I like how you showed our full service line there as well. Okay, I'm aware of time, we're running out. I spelt way too long on Planet Earth as usual. So again, I'm just going to stress some of the fundamentals here on the top, and then maybe Liam can just probably skip through the bottom. So remember, these fundamentals are real, and it's time to revisit the business case again. And what I would say about this year, to sum up where the trends are, this year is the year of strategy and positioning.
Yeah, and when it comes then to those strategy conversations, what we're seeing from organizations is they're going, well, they actually have risks in their supply chains, in their operating environments. They have risk to large clients who might be impacted by climate. So it's not just in their own upstream value chain, but also downstream when it comes to their clients, demands might be at risk because of the impact of climate change. Process optimization, ultimately sustainability is about using less resources, and using less resources is going to cost less money. And we have a question in here. I'll just use his first name, Paul. Paul's asked a number of questions, so obviously knows a lot about this topic. But one area that is driving energy efficiency and demand for this is that as organizations understand that, the cost of renewables has dropped significantly, the cost of being sustainable reduces your costs across the board. And so process optimization is really part of the sustainability journey. Then we have positioning, which is positioning around, finance particularly. At the moment, it's a little bit out of favor in that the Trump administration in the States have kind of moved away from big finance, have kind of moved away a little bit from this. But as Johnny pointed out, there's a lot of money to be spent in this area, and green assets will still be valuable, and being able to position yourself as a green company will be valuable. Also to distinguish your brand from it, and internally to get the staff motivated and encouraged by it. So I think we're seeing a number of drivers as to why organizations are choosing to continue to be sustainable and to put efforts into sustainability beyond CSRD.
Okay, I won't spend long on this because we've gone over time, I think. There is an interesting figure that Liam mentioned earlier. I'll draw your attention to the gold box on the left. And he mentioned about, at a macro level, the percentage of, say, GDP it would take to do all of this, to become a net zero society. And it's roughly 3%, as Liam said. When you think about the costs into the mid-century and second half of the century, as much as 1/3 of global GDP impacted, if not higher. So that's what we're looking at here. Invest 3% and mitigate the cost of 30% or 50% GDP. Bring that down to a company level, and you think about how you would invest in innovation. Typically, good practice is around 3% of revenues. And, what we're seeing here, and this is a survey actually from Kearney, very recent, is that 2/3 of CFOs, despite the noise, are still planning to allocate more than 2.1% to sustainability this year. So that's a good leading indicator. And just to skip through and finish up, there are 4 things we'd like to say really here, that the opportunity now is to create value. Start talking in business terms now. You don't have to trip up over sustainability language, which isn't helpful. You're talking about a new business case, the way it will be done. Work closely with your CFOs. I've mentioned CSOs here who have been the gatekeepers for sustainability, but your CFOs through the CSRD has become knowledgeable and wants to learn more. And also tap into communities of practice, learning communities, learning circles, whatever organizations you're in. We're not going to do it on our own. Company can't do it by itself. Work with Enterprise Ireland and other companies that are specifically called out, state agencies in the Climate Action Plan, business in the community being another as a non-profit. Enhance transparency. Use all of the work that's been done so far in the CSRD. One of the great things that came out of that was value chain mapping to understand your impacts, risks, and opportunities, and attaching them at different parts of the value chain. So you got a fuller understanding of your impact on the world. And then the last thing is, Liam's mentioned a great word, resilience. You're going to have to, really try and build, future-proof your business here. So much is changing so fast. The context is swirling around us. And we already know from what Kathleen said at the start about real emergencies that turn everything upside down. You might have seen recently what's happened in Spain and Portugal. We had our own storm Eowyn as well. That's the end. We went, sadly, sorry, Kathleen, we went over time. Not allowing
we
much
have a
time
few
for Q&A.
questions, Johnny.
Yeah, great.
Well, I'll tell you what, Johnny, you can see the questions well. We have Paul, who I think is probably quite expert in the area, who's asked a number of questions if you want to stop sharing. So I'll jump into Paul's question. If you had a look at the other questions there, Gerald, I think is next. So Paul has asked a number of questions around how we motivate change, how do we encourage the right change around energy usage, etc. To me, sustainability is a little bit like road safety. And how does the RSA communicate to us to slow down without us quickly switching the channel before the horrible accident occurs on the television? And I think it's very difficult, but I know, when I think about this problem, which I have, I look to people like Bill Gates who spend a huge amount of money on trying to make the world more sustainable. And to me, we need a lot of money on communication, because I think what we lack is the government is always prioritizing other things, other more urgent things. We need to try and prioritize the critical over the urgent. because we have lots of urgent problems here. And I think that's the biggest barrier, but it's a difficult question how we communicate these challenges. When it comes to demand and financial services, I do think that most of the financial services products we see aren't from the bank's perspective or the lender's perspective, they aren't getting cheaper money. If you look at it, if you have a green bond and you have to pay out 3% to the people who put in that money, is it cheaper because it's a green bond, or is it 3% whether you've gathered that money through a green bond or through some finances which is going to invest in weapons and coal, etc. So I think at the moment the cost of financing for financial institutions isn't different depending on whether it's green or brown or black, really significantly. And maybe that's where the ECB are certainly taking efforts. And when we look at this new, the UN Development Programme Global Project Office for Sustainable Finance in Dublin, like maybe that's where it can start to make progress. But until there's a real cost of borrowing for banks, financial institutions, which is reduced because of sustainability, a lot of this is just coming from marketing budgets when it comes to financing these. And I don't know, Johnny, if you've got the other question.
Yeah, I see a couple there from Paul. I might tackle Gerald's one if that's okay.
Yeah.
That's a very good question there, actually, on the same kind of theme around occupational health and safety is mentioned. The question is, do you see any legislation coming in with regards to mandatory company training for employees on sustainability issues, similar to what has been done in the past around health and safety legislation, etc., at a national or EU level? Now, that's a very good question. And what we saw through the CSRD coming in was, for example, our own accountants, auditors, and so on had to complete a set number of hours training to upskill, to become practitioners, qualified practitioners, to be able to conduct the work. And the reason the Omnibus come in is to create more time to allow this capability building to take place. Now, I don't know if in time, we all know that it depends on behavioural change, and we need to create the knowledge, in a sense, wells. I have mentioned communities of practice. I still think it's very much on a voluntary basis, where there's encouragement to join, say, Business in the Community Ireland network, or to interact with Enterprise Ireland, IDA, IBEC, and other bodies, so that you can actually develop your own skill. And we know that SkillNet is doing a lot as well. The universities in particular are some great work being taking place at the moment. I'm not going to mention one because I know it'll be given out if we don't mention the others, but they're all in a sense differentiating themselves for competitiveness on the international education front by putting sustainability at the heart of their entire strategy. So I would say in time, maybe like what happened with CSRD and our own practitioners, there will be mandatory requirements, but at the moment it seems like it's more voluntary. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so, but I think the fact that Kathleen's come on, I was going to answer another question.
Oh yeah,
Kathleen wants to get the last word in before 2 o'clock.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I suppose, yeah, we're time limited here, but yeah, we could keep talking, I think, all afternoon, I suppose, on this topic. And I suppose just in terms of kind of regulations and what they're driving, I suppose it is at the moment around kind of activities. So, energy audits are mandatory, say, for large businesses. The Energy Efficiency Directive is bringing, high energy users, SMEs into the fold. But it'll be interesting to see over time on the behavioural side of it, how things evolve. But it's kind of not in the near term, I suppose. At the moment, the focus is on the reporting and on the activities. But I'd just like to thank you both, I suppose, just for the fantastic insights that you've shared, from global to EU to national level to the actual business, I suppose, and it's businesses that we're speaking to here today. And I really just I liked just the line there, Johnny, in terms of that this is the year for strategy and positioning, and I think that's what we see as well when we're talking to client companies. It's really about them. A lot of companies have taken sustainability actions, but they mightn't have developed a strong sustainability strategy and plan. So it's about understanding what does sustainability mean to their business, prioritizing the areas to focus on, developing the action plan, and then the actual project implementation. And that's where we're going to see the impact. So it's about strategy leading to impact. And I think that's really important. And perhaps there's going to be, there's going to be less of a focus now on compliance and more time on that, hopefully developing strong sustainability strategies, resulting in the impact, and then reporting on that, because I think the communication of that is really important. And we see companies doing good things, but they mightn't be communicating it. So it is important to communicate it, whether it's through reports, through project labeling, through social media or websites. So yeah, look, I'd just like to thank you both. And it's just a reminder then as well, I suppose, to clients that are listening in, that Enterprise Ireland is absolutely keen to support companies on their journey. And we've a range of supports to help companies. I can just share my slides just really quickly before we wrap up. And I'll just share here now. Can you see my slide there okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll put it into presentation mode. So we have a number of supports to help companies, whether it's the training and advisory supports, or capital and RD&I supports. I won't go into them all there, but it's just a flag. Look, come talk to the green team, the sustainability team, come talk to your client advisor. And then also we have Kickstarter workshops, which are 3-hour webinars to help companies who are at their very early stage of their sustainability journey to develop an initial action plan. We have a Sustainability Leaders Programme in partnership with SkillNet, which is a more in-depth kind of 12-week programme. And then we have our webinars, and today is the first webinar for this series. So the next webinar is going to actually focus in on the eco-design for sustainable products. So as mentioned there in the slides, actually, a lot of our webinars will go into a lot of more detail in terms of what was touched on today around sustainability reporting for SMEs, around the Omnibus and the sustainability regulation. So we're hoping to do a deeper dive in some of those topics that were highlighted today. But just as ever, look for more information. You can check out our website, go to the sustainability supports page, or you can email green@enterpriseireland.com or reach out to your client advisor. So thanks again, Liam and Johnny and Ankush for helping out there in the background. And thanks to our attendees for joining, and hope you enjoyed the event, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.